Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Martin Indyk, the Executive Vice President of the Brookings Institution. Welcome to all of you, both here in the Falk Auditorium and also those of you who are watching online. We're webcasting live. And for those of you who wish to tweet, that's our hashtag for today's event. I'm really delighted to welcome such a distinguished panel of experts and practitioners on the issue of internal displacement to this important event at Brookings, to look back at the lessons over the past 20 years when the Brookings Project on Internal Displacement has been functioning at the very cutting edge of the issue of internal displacement, and to put a spotlight on the many challenges that remain as we look at the horrendous situation and plight of the internally displaced, particularly, of course, in Syria today, but in so many other countries as well. For over 20 years, the Brookings Project on Internal Displacement has worked to promote the human rights of these internally displaced persons, and toward that end, to support the mandate, first of the representative of the Secretary-General and now the Special Rapporteur on the human rights of IDPs. The accomplishment of this small project has been substantial, and it's a record that we are very proud of here at Brookings. Well, the number of IDPs is at an all-time high, and while IDPs continue to have unmet needs for protection and assistance, these are tasks which government and operational humanitarian agencies now have the responsibility to address. The Brookings Project has largely accomplished its purpose of raising awareness of the particular needs of IDPs and developing guidelines, providing guidance on how their rights can and should be upheld. As a result of the work of the Brookings Project and the leadership of some of the people that are on this panel today, working for the Secretary-General of the United Nations, with the support of so many countries that had an interest in this, we know how to deal with internally displaced persons. We know what it takes. We have the resolutions of the United Nations and the protocols and the guidelines and people who've been trained to deal with this situation. What we don't have is the political solutions that can take away the source of internal displacement, and that is very obvious in places like Syria. But the issue of IDPs is firmly on the international agenda. The guiding principles on internal displacement are widely accepted as customary international law. The African Union has adopted a binding international convention on internal displacement. More than 25 governments have adopted laws and policies on IDPs. Training materials and guidelines have been developed, and there is now a rich and solid base of empirical research on internal displacement. All of this has been spearheaded by a small team of Brookings staff working in a unique partnership with a series of independent UN experts. This partnership made it possible for the UN representatives to achieve much, much more than a single individual working on a voluntary basis could have ever hoped to accomplish. That partnership made it possible for Brookings research also to have a policy impact well beyond those of most academic institutes, and I would say well beyond much of the other endeavours across policy areas that our scholars here at Brookings work on. The commitment and vision of the project co-founders, Brookings Senior Fellow Roberta Cohen and Representative of the Secretary-General Francis Deng, sitting next to Roberta, their commitment and vision in setting up this project back in 1994, as well as overseeing the development of the normative framework on IDPs and carrying out important substantive work, served as a foundation for the later work by the Representative Secretary General Walter Kalin, who's also with us today, Brookings Senior Fellow Elizabeth Ferris, who will be moderating the second panel, and Special Representative Chiloka Bayani, who unfortunately at the last minute was unable to join us. As the project on internal displacement comes to an end, the Brookings Institution is proud, very proud, to have been a part of the making of human rights history, and is proud of the fact that over 30 million IDPs are benefiting, either directly or indirectly, from the project's work and the partnership between the project and the special representative, and before that, the representative of the Secretary General. In our area of work, we are not often able to conclude that a program has definitively brought about lasting change in the international policy arena, but we can say that and more about this project's work. The many events, publications, guidelines, training materials, guidelines, by the way, that are outside if you'd like to collect some of these, policy briefs, etc., developed by the project will continue to provide guidance on how to protect the human rights of those displaced within the borders of their own country. And I hope that this afternoon's roundtable of discussions will contribute to our understanding of both the lessons learned from this unique project and the challenges that remain for those who will carry on the work. I'm now happy to turn over for the moderation of this panel discussion, Roberta Cohen, who is, as I said, the co-founder of the Project on Internal Displacement. I want to say a special personal word to Roberta, who was here when I joined the institution in the year 2001. Roberta is an unusual combination of great intelligence and knowledge, policy smarts, but a deep commitment to humanitarian causes. And she really has served as a model for us here at Brookings as we strive to improve the world through policy-relevant research and activities. So I want to thank you, Roberta. Francis, I want to thank you for your leadership and vision, and Walter as well, and Elizabeth Ferris. The project, it's rarely in life that you get to a point where you feel you've actually managed to finish the job. Obviously the challenge is still there. But I think that the IDP project and the work of the RSG is something that you both should be very proud of, even though the challenges remain. And I think that we all owe you both a real debt of gratitude, and you too, Walter, a real debt of gratitude. And I just want to say, on behalf of Brookings, thank you. Thank you very much.
Martin, thank you for those generous comments. That was a wonderful statement. This is a historic occasion, and it is an extraordinary group of people on the panel and also in the audience who have been involved with this subject. But I want to thank especially the Brookings Institution, because it really was the institution that sponsored the research and also mobilized the thinking that enabled us to break new ground. I mean, new ideas, new approaches, new policies, all of this on a subject that we saw as a global crisis. We called it the global crisis of internal displacement in the 1990s. So I thank the Brookings Institution tremendously, and your leadership as well at this time. I'd like everyone to remember in the 1990s when we began, that there was an explosion of civil wars following and emanating mostly from the Cold War, and that brought into view millions of people who were forced from their homes by conflict and human rights violations, and who were not refugees. They did not cross borders. They were destitute, and they received little or no protection or assistance from their own governments or from the international community. I first saw IDPs in 1984 in Ethiopia, when I accompanied an aid shipment. And I was told then that if these people crossed the border, the UN would be waiting to help them. But if they stayed inside, which most of them did, they would receive little from their own government. And as for international institutional arrangements, they would have to be developed sort of on an ad hoc basis, and they were. But hundreds of thousands of people perished. And for me, it was one of those experiences we all witness that disturb our sense of how the world should be and compel our involvement. In this institution, we work to bring the situation of IDPs to the fore on the full understanding that protecting people inside their own countries under the jurisdiction of their governments was going to be a challenge. Today, we are being asked to look at the lessons learned from the experience, and I'd like to point to one of the initial lessons, and that is something Martin Indyk referred to, and that's the value of a partnership between a think tank and the United Nations. Francis Deng from Brookings was appointed, as you know, the representative of the Secretary General on IDPs in 1992, and the project was established. But let me give you an idea of how far we've come and recall some of the questions that we were given at that time. How do you define an IDP? They're in their own countries. How do you deal with sovereignty? Should there be a legal framework? What should national laws and policies say? What national and international arrangement should be established? When does internal displacement end? The UN actually sent a letter to Brookings posing that question. I am persuaded that the work done from this institution on these questions could not have been done from within the UN system itself. And that is largely because the UN system at the time was geared to avoid any substantial intrusion into the internal affairs of states, although some in the system were ready to push the limits. I remember one UN official came over to Brookings and wanted to pose a question and said, "Do you and Francis know that you're making a revolution?" And that person was pleased. A man, I remember, official at the UN in New York, held up his arm and he said, "We don't do protection of IDPs. That is too controversial, but tell me your formulation." So I began to realize that those within the UN system, and there were a number who wanted change, preferred outsiders to rattle the house and to bring the issue forward. And that I came to see as an important part of the partnership. A second initial lesson that I learned was the importance of forging links between the human rights and the humanitarian worlds. I brought with my involvement a human rights perspective and saw it was not part of how the international community understood internal displacement. And then it became clear that links also had to be forged with the security and development worlds, and that a coming together of all these different communities is essential to addressing internal displacement effectively. Today, the term IDP is sometimes subsumed under broader headings, like civilians in conflict, populations of concern, affected communities. But always remember that IDPs have special needs, and that was one of the principal lessons we learned. If addressing their needs is overlooked or is lost in mainstreaming, internal displacement will not be effectively resolved or addressed. It needs to be, because, as Martin mentioned, there are today as many as 38 million men, women, and children forcibly uprooted by conflict and human rights violations, and the number has accelerated. There are also millions more uprooted by natural disasters and by development projects. Becoming internally displaced, as Roger Zetter of Oxford recently reminded us, is often the first step on a long and a perilous journey. It is often the precursor of cross-border movements and an early warning of potential refugee and complex mixed migration. It is a source of instability and human misery in different countries. It deserves a great deal of attention. The history of the efforts to address the problem must be seen as part of a journey, and there's a long way to go. At the beginning of the journey was actually a lobbying effort to create the position of the representative of the Secretary General, and that's where Beth Ferris and I first met, and I think we've come full circle, Beth. The launch, the great moment, was the actual creation of that position, and it's Francis Deng who we're going to turn to, who served as the first representative of the Secretary General for 12 years, from 1992 to 2004. And he was a towering figure in the entire enterprise and left an indelible mark on the approaches that were adopted by the United Nations toward internally displaced persons. Francis's bio is in your packets or out on the table, as actually all the other people on the panel, so I'm not going to go into details about his illustrious career. I'll just mention that subsequent to his being representative on IDPs, he became the special advisor of the Secretary General on the prevention of genocide and is now South Sudan's ambassador to the United Nations. Francis, it was such a wonderful experience working with you, and I want to remind that you had to deal with, first and foremost, the issue of sovereignty. You had to balance sovereignty with, at the same time, advocating for the protection of IDPs. Can you describe the approach that you adopted and the impact this had on dealing with governments, and what do you see as the lessons learned?
Well, thank you very much. Let me begin by saying that it's a great pleasure to be back at Brookings, where I was for some 12 years. And Martin, I want to add my voice to Roberta's for thanking you for your very kind words. I also want to begin, I'm very tempted to begin with an anecdote. Some years ago, several of us who had been in various positions in government went to meet with the then OAU Secretary General. And after a very nice meeting with him, he took us to his group staff who were assembled, and he said, I would like to introduce you to our extinguished leaders. And the interesting thing is he was not joking, made it even more serious. Well, it was funny to refer to individuals as extinguished, but I must say the institution that has really served a very important cause for some 20 years to be referred to as extinguished is not at all a funny concept. I want to say that my working with Roberta, in fact, the first time I heard of IDPs was in a conference that Roberta organized. And it was shortly after that that I received a surprise call from the then Secretary General, Brookings-LSE, to say, Francis, your name has come up to be Special Representative from the Secretary General on IDPs. And I was delighted. So I'm asking you to take the position. Brookings-LSE and I had worked closely. He had been Minister of State for Foreign Affairs of Egypt, and I had been Minister of State for Foreign Affairs of Sudan. So I said to him, I'm honored and pleased, but could you kindly have your people give me more details as to what this involves before I give you my final word? And he said, come on, Francis, I know you quite well. I know how concerned you are with these kinds of issues. This is not only a global crisis, it's one that affects your country of Sudan the most. And in the Sudan, it's your people in Southern Sudan who are the worst hit. I cannot see how you can say no. So I'll tell them you have accepted, and if later you have any questions, we can discuss. I soon got to learn that this was a very sensitive issue. And as Roberta has hinted, it was an issue that had been very heavily debated. The appointment of the Special Representative Secretary General was a compromise. It was meant to be only for 1 year to do the study on this issue. And it was intimated to me by someone later that the expectation was that after the year I would come with my report. They would thank me and say, fine, you can go now, everything is done. But then after I submitted my first report, they extended it for 2 years, and eventually it was extended every 3 years. And interestingly enough, Brookings-LSE is also the one who suggested to me, what exactly are we talking about? Who are the IDPs, and where are they, and what are their needs? Who's meeting their needs, and what are the gaps that need to be met? And I would like you to do this study in a neutral institution, a research institution that is not hampered by the sensitivities of the UN system. And so that's how Robert and I then started the project here at Brookings, and the leadership of Brookings was very supportive. I have to say, and I hope Roberta won't mind this, working so closely with her, and without her, there's no question at all that I could have done what we were able to do. And I can summarize our relationship and cooperation with the late Richard Holbrooke introducing us as Mr. and Mrs. IDPs. Now, once I came to realize how sensitive the issue was, I then asked myself, how do you deal with this issue that is very much part of the sovereignty of the state, and we know how sensitive sovereignty is. And fortunately, we had been working in the Africa project at Brookings that I started on looking at conflicts in Africa in the context of the end of the Cold War. During the Cold War, we used to see conflicts, even internal or regional, as proxy wars of the superpowers. With the end of the Cold War, the withdrawal of strategic interests and the global, I apologize. I should have known better.
It's a nice tune.
So what we did was that with the end of the Cold War, problems would now be seen in their proper context as internal or regional, and the responsibility for dealing with them would have to be reconsidered. Instead of depending on the superpowers, countries would be then called upon to deal with their own situations. Since human rights and humanitarian concerns emerge as the most important basis for international relations, it was obvious that sovereignty would be asserted by the states as a barricade against international involvement in these areas. And that is how we began to try to work on recasting sovereignty to make the case that sovereignty should not be seen as a barricade against the outside world. Sovereignty should be seen in a positive way as imposing responsibility on the states, and if need be, with the support of the international community. And if the state fails and people are suffering and dying in large numbers, the world is then called upon to get involved in a more robust way. So, as I often say, the first 5 minutes with a president or a minister were critical in telling them, I realize this problem is by definition internal. It falls under your sovereignty. I am respectful of your sovereignty, but I don't see it negatively as a barricade against the outside world. I see it as a positive concept of state responsibility for its people. And if it needs help, to call on the world to help. But then you say, in a careful way, politely, but if you fail to discharge your responsibility and your people are suffering and dying, the world is not going to watch and do nothing. They will find one way or another to get involved, to intervene. So the best way of protecting sovereignty is to discharge the responsibilities of sovereignty. Now this notion, which we developed at Brookings, ending with a volume after a series of volumes called Sovereignty as Responsibility, gave me the framework, the normative framework for engaging governments, as I said, with respect to the IDP. And this was reasonably well received by governments. In fact, even countries that had been very critical of the idea of creating a mandate on internal displacement, to my surprise, very nice surprise, began to speak every year complimentary remarks about the way the mandate was being carried out. And around the world, I saw governments changing dramatically once you begin to talk about their responsibilities. In fact, there was a minister of Sudan who was notorious for being very, very critical of international involvement in internal affairs and very protective of sovereignty. In a meeting we had at ECOSOC, and for the first time, I made a presentation along these lines. He raised his hands and surprised everybody by saying, if this is the approach that is being adopted, we fully agree with it. And everybody was surprised by that. Again, I can give quite a number of examples of responses I got to this approach. But let me say, since I have very limited time and I'm not looking at my watch, when I was appointed as special advisor on the prevention of genocide, I faced the same concern about how governments would respond. And I realized that although we all talk about preventing and punishing genocide, the reality is that precisely because of its sensitivity, people are usually in denial. Those who perpetrate genocide and those who would be called upon to intervene. And so what I did was to bring it down, to demystify genocide and perceive it or define it as an extreme form of identity-related conflicts. Conflicts that result not from our differences, but from the way we manage differences, discrimination, exclusion, marginalization, dehumanization. And therefore, the remedy is constructive management of diversity, which means removing discrimination, inclusiveness, and all of that, which again is primarily the responsibility of the government. And so when you then present it to the government to say, this really is an issue that deals with how you manage your differences, how you manage diversities, the response is always quite positive. In fact, in one country, somebody said, the prime minister said to me, you know, when we heard you were coming and with your title, we worried that you think there is genocide in this country. But the way you have now explained it, we do have very serious problems of diversity, whether based on ethnicity or religion or region, and we need help. And we need the United Nations to give us help. In ASEAN region, where governments were said to be extremely sensitive about sovereignty. I found the response also very positive. Somebody even said to me, you know, the only problem you have is your title. Why don't you change your title? And of course, it was not my choice. Let me just say that the importance also of partnership between Brookings and the United Nations was that we were able to use different hats. When I spoke as representative of Secretary General on internal displacement, I could say that I had to be sensitive to the bureaucratic issues of diplomatic approaches. When we were dealing with the project, we had more freedom to be outspoken, even in our research and all of that. But when we really wanted to be outrageous, we hired some consultants who could do the job for us. You know. So I have to say, as has already been said by Roberta and Martin, this partnership really proved to be unique to the point where many of the UN mandates began to look at the Brookings project as providing a model. In some cases, admired. In some cases, elements of jealousy came in. And all in all, it really is both sad to be seeing the project ending, but at the same time, we have laid a foundation which will continue in various ways. Many of the people here have responsibilities that are relevant to the IDP issue in their own institutions. And so I have to say that although just as we were told that we were extinguished, we existed despite being extinguished. The concept of sovereignty as responsibility has evolved to the point where we now have what we call the responsibility to protect, which has been documented as founded on the approach we adopted about sovereignty as responsibility. The only difference is when we speak of sovereignty as responsibility, we are clearly seen as placing primary responsibility on the state. But when we talk about R2P, although they have the same three pillars, people tend to think of R2P as a basis for intervention, which is why it is controversial and is still ambivalently being seen and resisted to a large extent. As I said, I haven't been looking at my watch.
I think we have to
move on. So I'll end here.
Oh, that's wonderful. Francis, it's wonderful to hear your formulation again. And sovereignty as responsibility did, as Francis say, become a building block for the responsibility to protect. So I think the conceptual framework of dealing with a problem that's intrusive of internal affairs was begun here at Brookings and is really underpinning many other concepts now internationally. We're going to turn now to the development of the legal framework for IDPs, the guiding principles on internal displacement. And if Francis and I were Mr. and Mrs. IDP, Bob Goldman, Robert Goldman, and Walter Kalin are Mr. and Mr. Guiding principles. But we first start with Bob Goldman, who's a distinguished international lawyer and professor at the Washington College of Law with expertise in humanitarian law. He prepared the initial drafts of the guiding principles and then worked with the other lawyers in a team and broader groups as well in reviewing and completing them. And the principles have become the standard reference internationally. And in 2005, the World Summit endorsed them as an important international framework for the protection of IDPs. Bob, I remember you insisted on basing the guiding principles on the special needs of IDPs and on staying within the confines of existing law in addressing those needs. Did these approaches contribute to the acceptance, wide acceptance of the principles? What are the lessons that you learned?
Well, first of all, let me say I'm delighted to be here, and particularly with the four of us. It's kind of like a reunion of the Beach Boys of sorts on a hot summer day or whatever. But as we did The answer to the question is, had we just taken a rights-based approach, it would have really led us nowhere. When I got the call from you on behalf of Francis to chair the American team and so forth to undertake all of the research, I had a meeting down at the American Society of International Law that called together some of the leading international lawyers and human rights people in this country, and I remember, he will go unnamed, an extremely distinguished professor of international law, and he sort of said to me, what's the big deal? He says, they have the same rights as everybody else. They remain within international territory. And that sealed it for me, that if we were going to do anything, we had to really take an approach that was based on what the actual specific needs, which were gleaned from the work that had already been done in the field for IDP. So we took this needs-based approach. And as a result of a study that we did that took some time, but looked at a variety of situations of tensions, disturbances, not encompassing IHL, and then different forms of armed conflict, we looked at the various principles of human rights law and IHL to determine whether or not they were sufficient to meet those needs. And in that study, we concluded that there were basically 17 major areas where there were gray areas or clear-cut gaps in the law. And this is what led, that is, by identifying that, I think that helped Francis an awful lot in being able to say, look at this, and the study was done, I think it was quite careful. And fortunately, he brought Walter Kalin in to sort of reconcile some differences between the European approach and my team's approach. And Walter just did a superb job on this, and what emerged was basically a needs-based approach and so forth. So when we put these things together, we were able to draw on existing law. And which states, frankly, it's no different in certain respects than, for instance, in the Helsinki process and so forth during the Cold War with the human rights basket of reciting pre-existing human rights standards and so forth that should guide the parties. It was clear we couldn't do a treaty. First of all, it would have been destroyed because you could never have gotten the inclusive definition that we wanted, and which we ended up with. It's clear there are many states that never would have accepted the notion of a development-based or man-made or whatever, and so forth. So by opting for guiding principles and basing it essentially on pre-existing hard law and by tweaking it to the specific needs of IDPs, I think we put together something that was extremely useful. Let me mention now, even though in all of our writings, and particularly which Walter and I did, as we did some joint writing, and we were very careful to say, look, this reflects and is consistent with existing law. We did something, however, that eluded most states, fortunately, and so I can talk about it. If you look at Principle 2, even though we took the position that the duty and so forth was essentially with the territorial state and so forth, Principle 2 said that these principles are to be applied by all authorities, groups, etc. What does that mean? We knew what it meant, non-state actors. Secondly, what we did is, in the innovation here, was it applies human rights laws to non-state actors, even in situations of armed conflict. This is a major innovation. And this is one of the things, frankly, that I think helped to kill the Turku process that Ted Moran and a bunch of other very distinguished international lawyers tried to do. So in effect, it was written in such a way that, fortunately, that this was something that was not picked up on. But it enabled us to first do this major several hundred-page study to identify the gaps, and then to articulate a series of standards applicable to all who may be involved in situations entailing displacement.
I remember when the first draft went to the Commission on Human Rights. I was just by coincidence on the American delegation, and every state that was concerned or wondered about the principles would ask me, because I was on the American delegation, does this exceed the law? And I know that I always said not at all, rest assured. But I know that Walter has referred to what he calls creative development, which has focused, I think, on some other parts of the principles, like on humanitarian assistance, and that states cannot deny humanitarian aid without being arbitrary if they don't have good reason. And those particular provisions, I think, are quite stand out also, as I think maybe Walter can explain that, as really being ahead of the time in terms of internal affairs and humanitarian aid. But Walter, if we turn to you, do you have any comments on that? First on the humanitarian assistance part, because I think there was a bit of creative development, which is now accepted. We were ahead of, but not that much. Walter is an eminent Swiss international lawyer and professor who chaired the legal process, as Bob has said, leading to the guiding principles. And then he became the second representative of the Secretary General on IDPs from 2004 to 2010, and I had the pleasure of working with him. Let me say he's currently the envoy of the Nansen Initiative on disaster-induced cross-border displacement, and that seemed to follow well from his very strong mark as RSG of trying to ensure that protection extended to those IDPs uprooted by natural disasters. So Walter, I wonder if you can comment on the first, and also I would recall that you saw with great vision that for the guiding principles to have impact on the ground, they'd have to be incorporated into laws and policies at the national level. And you influenced governments in a number of instances to adopt such. Can you tell us about that experience too, and any lessons you consider learned?
Thank you so much, Roberta. Even though I've never been been employed in this building, I've been here so often that it's also kind of a return to a place that for part of my life has become very important. You referred to the notion of progressive development of international law. Yeah, we did some of that. Not in the sense of creating something really new, but just thinking existing law to its end. So, for instance, we saw that on the one hand, there was General Assembly resolution saying that humanitarian assistance only could be provided with the consent of the state concerned. We have such language also in part of the international humanitarian law. But we also understood that the state has an obligation under human rights law to cooperate with the international community, to implement rights to food, to housing, to health. And thinking that through meant if a state was unable to provide the necessary humanitarian assistance itself, then it had to turn to the international community. And this meant then it had to authorize humanitarian access unless it could deny it for very good reasons. I think we were the first to really write into a document, a soft law document, the notion of the prohibition of arbitrary denial of humanitarian assistance. And to me, it was really a very important moment when last year, in February, in a Syria resolution, the Security Council used exactly that kind of a notion and made it very clear that denial of humanitarian access can amount to a violation of international humanitarian law and implicitly also of human rights law. Turning to the issue of domestic laws, my very first mission as RSG in 2005 was to Nepal. I arrived there and the government asked me, "What are you doing here?" "Yes, we have IDPs." Let me check it. We have 8,967 IDPs. Okay, very precise. I had a meeting with the UN country team and they said, "What are you doing here? We don't have any IDPs. We haven't seen any camps, any tents." I took both government representatives and UN country teams members on my visits, and around each and every corner we identified IDPs. There were at least 100,000. IDMC said about 200,000, maybe even more. And one of my recommendations in that report was to the government, develop an IDP policy, adapt your laws, enshrine it in law, because I had learned from Francis Deng, sovereignty means responsibility. And how can you live up to that responsibility if first you don't have any agreement on who an IDP is? Because this was the problem. The government said, IDPs are those we have registered on the basis of a very complicated process. And for some UN colleagues, IDPs were people living in camps. So the first thing that needs to be done is to agree on the notion of IDP. And of course, I recommended to adopt a notion that was in line with the guiding principles. And in fact, they did it when they adopted their IDP strategy. But I also felt, talking to authorities there, how can they, now that they have seen there are more IDPs, really react to that situation? Because nobody was responsible. There was no ministry on internal displacement. There was no budget line for people displaced in an armed conflict. There simply was a lack of attribution, allocation of responsibilities. There was a lack of tying those powers and responsibilities to the financial mechanisms, the budget. And there was a legal void. And I also saw that on that very first mission, and it repeated itself time and again when I went to countries, that the normal laws they had, and this was of course also a response, we have all the laws and these are our citizens, so they fall under those laws. Why do we need something specific? That these laws were made for normal situations and had detrimental effects on situations of internal displacement. Just such things as IDP children were not admitted to schools. Why? Simply because according to the Nepal education law, when you moved and sent your children to a new school, you only could do that with a document issued by the headmaster of your former school, with all the grades, etc. on it. Do you really go to the headmaster if your village is attacked and you have to run? There were problems then later when they moved towards elections that you have, according to the law, vote at your place of residence, and that's your usual place of residence. And again, IDPs by definition are not living at their usual habitual place of residence. So exactly those who had been displaced could not vote and determine the political future of the place they had come from, and had to give in somehow to their enemies, those who had been responsible for their displacement. There were many people who had huge problems because they had lost their documentation and it could not be reissued because you had to go to the district headquarters of your district to do that. And by definition, they had to flee. They were not there. So, again, the specific needs. are not reflected in the legislation. And this is why it is so important. The guiding principles are great, but they are just mere paper unless they are incorporated into domestic legislation. In most countries, international law, yes, does bind the state vis-à-vis the international community, but they cannot be applied internally. So this is important. And it's important to clarify the powers, responsibilities. And it's important to ensure that the financing is there and can be made available, because in most countries, budgets depend on somewhere a provision in the law. And it's also important to send out the message to the IDPs: we care about you. And this is why we took up this issue as one of the priorities. And the Brookings project has really contributed a lot. I would say has been, for some time, the main actor pushing the idea of domestic laws and policies. The project has developed guidance, manuals, different kinds, has conducted courses with government officials in San Remo on how to draft IDP policies and laws. And whenever we went, Francis had started that in Uganda, but you still had to fight for the recognition of the guiding principles. But with the breakthrough in 2005 at the Millennium Summit, we had that acknowledgement, an important international framework for the protection of IDPs. And this opened up room to talk about laws and policies. And the project during my time, and very much so under my successor, Gianluca Beiani, has contributed to develop IDP laws and policies in different countries: Afghanistan, Kenya, Yemen, Central African Republic, of course, before the crisis, and so on and so on. The problem now is, who will take over that work? Because we really can forget about the guiding principles and all the achievements if you don't have systematic work on implementing not only the guiding principles, but all that comes with it. The allocation of powers and responsibilities, the institutional setups, the rights, the remedies. It has to be done. Without that, numbers of IDPs just will pile up, continue to pile up. The huge number we have is due to protracted situations. People who have been displaced even before the project started in some countries, for instance, in Europe, in the South Caucasus. And why do these numbers pile up even a long time after the end of the conflict? Because governments do not assume their responsibilities. And often still, it's a lack of these legal frameworks, the laws. So there's a lot to do.
I think what's really interesting here is that you do have some of the tools that everybody needs for working on this problem. The sovereignty as responsibility as the overall concept, and the guiding principles on internal displacement as the legal framework. And I think history is made on those two. A lot of work is required, as Walter says, in future. Bob Goldman has called such work voluntary servitude. I remember he put a tremendous amount of hours into working on this because he felt it was so important. And I would hope that in following what Walter said, that there's a lot of voluntary servitude. I'm sure there already is in this audience. Now, we are running rather short of time, but we are now heading toward international institutional arrangements for IDPs, which I sometimes see as a rather slow-moving train that periodically tries to adjust its course. Shelley Pitterman is the UNHCR regional representative in the United States and has served in positions around the world for HCR. Shelley, initially the UN agencies resisted broadening their responsibilities on a consistent basis to include IDPs. Yet by 2005, there was some readiness to make the international response to IDPs more predictable with humanitarian reform, and UNHCR assumed then a lead role with regard to protection of IDPs in conflict situations. Can you tell us about how UNHCR expanded its roles and responsibilities, and what are the lessons here with regard to IDPs? And I'm going to ask you to do it in a very short time frame. Thank you.
You're welcome. Well, yes, it was at that time that Erica Feller, the Assistant High Commissioner for Protection at the time, newly appointed, turned the corner to basically say, yes, UNHCR will engage, I think inspired as well by the guiding principles and all of the work that you've accomplished here. I have to say that I'm very humbled to be here, and actually the person who should be in the seat is the current Assistant High Commissioner for Protection, Volker Turk, with whom you've all worked very closely, who apologizes for not being able to come because of standing committee and other responsibilities. But it's very clear that the Brookings project, and I've been working with Beth more I guess I'm the second generation here, has really been an inspiration and an impetus for concrete action. And UNHCR has been under pressure from the outside, but also from within, to do more and to lead more and to coordinate more. And I think that there's been progress. You know, we read about the challenges with the Interagency Standing Committee, the challenges that are in terms of resourcing and actually implementing activities in support of internally displaced persons. When the project started, I was in Guinea, and then I was in Burundi in the early 90s, in 92 to 95, and there were internally displaced populations there, certainly, but never did we think of them in terms of internally displaced. And when approaching the Burundian army or the Burundian authorities to help Burundian displaced, it was all ad hoc, it was all relationship, it was all, well, what should I do? It was basically instinctual, as we were working without a framework. And now, 20 years later, it's very clear that there is one, and it's operational, and it's institutionally embedded. It's certainly within UNHCR, there's a pillar dedicated to it, very dependent on resources, certainly. But there is also a framework through the Global Protection Cluster. There are country protection clusters, some 27 of them, as we meet. There's a commitment to train up staff to lead these protection clusters. UNHCR just recently issued or reissued a guidance which talks about not just the principles, but also the types of activities that we should be accountable for in a way, in terms of results, in terms of activities and outputs, whether it's in relation to SGBV or coordination, coexistence with the community, children's rights, basic needs, and the like. So there is an operational framework that needs to be nurtured and continued. The fear is, and it was reflected in the Brookings report, that we'll mainstream this into oblivion, is how it was put. And I think you can rest assured, at least on behalf of UNHCR, my understanding is that there's a very clear commitment within the Division of International Protection and at the highest levels to do as much as we can to continue to nurture that dedicated framework for dealing with IDPs, to working with governments, to continuing to help train the capacity building activities that need to continue in order to indeed firm up this state responsibility to protect.
Thank you, Shirley. I'm going to turn to Susan Martin and ask her to do Mission Impossible, which is not the first time I've asked her to do that in our time together. Susan is a distinguished professor and director of the Institute for the Study of International Migration at Georgetown, and the past president of the International Association for the Study of Forced Migration. She's originated many ideas in the migration field, and we wanted to ask her to comment first. I just wonder if you've written much on institutional arrangements, and I just wonder if you give a quick comment on how you see the sort of future in terms of institutional arrangements and the extent to whether agencies that have other core mandates can accommodate IDPs effectively enough. And then with regard to the research community, let me just throw a few questions at you because I know you condense very well. How do you see that community as having contributed to the development of new approaches for IDPs? And I know it has dealt with institutional arrangements. Did the growing attention to IDPs broaden refugee studies into studies of forced migration? Do you see policy advocacy as necessary to research? And was enough research paid to the third phase of displacement, to recovery, reintegration, and development, which is now considered the weakest link? So I'm going to ask you about lessons learned.
Thank you, since I can give an hour speech on each of those issues. Trying to do it in 7, 8, 10 minutes will be difficult.
Even less, yes.
Even less.
Yes.
Particularly since we do want to get to the audience.
Yes.
Let me just say on the institutional arrangements, sitting next to someone from UNHCR saying that IDPs are part of their mandate is such a sea change that's occurred over the last 20 years. What I would hope is that in the future, though, what we work on, and it's somewhat along the lines of what Walter and others were saying, is that it's really implementation that is the challenge. Because even though there may be a recognition institutionally in a lot of organizations now that IDPs are a part of their mandate and a part of their activity, I think when we get to the ground level, we're still too often seeing huge gaps. Just look at Syria. We don't have to go much beyond that. So although one can see huge, huge progress, and I think the engagement of UNHCR in these issues has marked a major change. I think transforming what is a commitment to protection to actual protection is still lagging very far behind. And I'm sure that the next panel will talk much more about that. With regard to the role of the research community, I think that this is an issue in which the research really helped to bring attention to internal displacement as an issue and to a much better understanding of what the needs of the IDPs were and where the gaps were. And in turn, though, as recognition grew that internally displaced persons had so many of the same needs, whether it was for assistance or protection, and that this was occurring regardless of whether it was conflict-related persecution, human rights violations, or development projects, natural disasters, that all of that causation in a way or geography was less important than figuring out how to protect vulnerable people who were in life-threatening situations. I think we saw as a result of that recognition a total transformation of what had been narrowly refugee studies into forced migration studies. And the research community now looking at both refugees and IDPs, but also looking at situations in a much more holistic manner, recognizing that if we're talking about Syria, to come back to that, one can't segment refugees are here, IDPs are here. We have to have one system for this box and a totally different system for that box. That I think too often that is a failure. So research in terms, I'm going to say a few words about the project because I've worked so closely with both Roberta and Elizabeth over the course of this years, as well as, of course, Francis and Walter, is that the project really not only benefited from the fact that there was an external research. Brookings does now, because of this long history, stand before the IDP project. But a lot of us went back to the Refugee Policy Group, which produced a lot of the initial research, not least of which was what you were working on, Roberta. The fact that the whole work on the guiding principles and the operationalizing of them was accompanied by Masses in Flight, Roberta and Francis's epic opus on IDPs, and that there was a really serious evidence base for all of the advocacy that was going to happen on IDPs, I think was crucial to the success. And then Bill Fredlich and I were reminiscing yesterday about the efforts at the U.S. Committee for Refugees and the Refugee Policy Group to try to get the data, to try to get numbers. That then was taken over by IDMC, and again, without having that capacity to be able to talk in concrete terms about the phenomenon, not just in it's big, but to try to understand just what the dimensions are. I don't think we'd have had the progress. And if I just think about the number of projects that Roberta, you and Beth have gotten me into over the course of this period that emanating from the project, I started noting them. When Displacement Ends, Joint brought in a lot of researchers to work on cases to understand that process. How IDPs are integrated into peace processes. Again, thinking about different cases. I see Patricia here who worked on that project. Development-induced displacement. Michael Trinia's in the audience. I don't see Court Robinson, but he was engaged to try to formulate how the definition, which was very broad, became a definition not just of conflict and human rights violations, but of development-induced displacement. The institutional frameworks, all of the work that we've done together. I noted Francis saying that when there was a really controversial issue, you went outside of the project. Well, yeah, I ended up with 20 years of research in that area, like my book that's now out. More recently, planned relocation in the context of environmental change. These were all things that came to the project's attention because of the practical policy issues that were coming up, the operational issues, the program issues. And it was the engagement of the research community, which I think helped to find solutions, but also by engaging us, helped to transform what we do into what I think is a much better formulation in terms of an issue that we all have concern about, because these are life-threatening situations, and in which if we continue to think about our small boxes, will likely lead to, unfortunately, massive loss of life. So I think the project has done a phenomenal job, and I just want to personally thank both you, Roberta and Beth, for having gotten me involved in the situation after, of course, I got you guys involved even earlier on. And thank you so much.
Susan, thank you. I just want to say Francis Dang has to depart. Francis, it was wonderful to see you as always, and we thank you for your participation. Ask Susan if she would turn to the audience and ask for questions. And
hey, Roberta asked me to moderate the questions, but before I actually open it up, I want to call on somebody in the audience who, in a way, should have been up here, but I want to just make sure that we get some perspective. We haven't talked much about the role of civil society in this process, and that particularly at the national and local level. And Javon, I wanted to just really call on you for a few words in terms of the lessons you've learned as somebody working in the consortium of humanitarian agencies in Sri Lanka. and having come all of this way to join us. If you please say a few words.
Speak from here, is that all right? Okay. Thank you very much. I hadn't planned to stand up. Okay. I hadn't planned to intervene today, but just listening to all that's been said and trying to recap on some of the developments back in Sri Lanka and in the region. Francis's words about outrageous sort of interventions, I think the project sort of commissioned many outrageous interventions, whether it was practitioners' handbooks. We looked very deeply at the annotations. We dug up the annotations and made it into handbooks of national use. Even the concept of guiding principles. I remember Francis came to Sri Lanka in '93, and we were going to hand deliver a letter to get him back in 2000, but it was stalled because of some kind of institutional difficulties from outside. The Prime Minister's office actually issued the letter, but it was prevented from outside. So that was in 2000, which was sad because the next visit was Walter, which was in 2007 or 8. We could have advanced the induction of the guiding principles into our national policy framework if Francis had been able to come 8 years earlier. So that are the kind of difficulties we had. But subsequently, I must say, guiding principles has become the norm. It's part of policy, not because the UN have asked the government, but the government on its own has gone out and done it. Various, within quotes, outrageous interventions have inserted those words in. It's a norm. But Chaloka's last report on Sri Lanka, and which is very true, it's outrageous that long after the conflict has ended, we still have displaced people with unmet needs. And that's an outrage. And somebody else mentioned, I think Walter, about, he rounds corners in Kathmandu or Nepal and finds IDPs. We have IDPs we don't notice, which is outrageous too. We have IDPs who are in urban contexts, not just development-induced. Poverty induces in the internal displacement. They're completely forgotten. So there's a lot more work to be done, I feel. The principles out there. Walter asked what's going to happen next, which is true. I think much more needs to be done. It's not enough just to have the principles. We've had advances, no doubt about it. But I do believe very strongly that both, regrettably, refugees and internal displacement contests and advocates for attention around the world. Very regrettable. And both numbers are high. I believe internal displacement is at 3-point-some million at the moment, 3.8 million internal displaced around the world.
38.2.
Good grief. Right. Then the question arises, what is the institutional focus? Where is it going to be looked at? Is it sufficient just to have somebody advise in Secretary General? The other point I would like to mention to those in the audience, as well as to Brookings, is there are regional variations. There are regional advances. It's very important to potentially capture it. The project has given the foundation. Much work has happened. I think I've looked at partners, Calcutta, Vienna, Oslo, London, Geneva, Jakarta, Bangkok, not to mention what's going on in the Americas, the Africas. It'll be useful. It'll be stronger. The focus on displacement will be stronger if the regional work can also be stitched together, held together, but done in the regions. We'll be richer. Maybe we might be sooner in getting to solutions in the regions than what we are doing right now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me open it up then for questions. We'll take 3 at a time. I suspect we may not have time for much more, but if you're short on your questions and the responses. In the front here, please.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for a nice presentation. I really gained a lot. It is very ironic. First of all, my name is Sudha Rajput from the School of Conflict Analysis and Resolution. It is very ironic today that the Brookings project is coming to a close when I'm trying to launch my career in displacement. So way to go from here. I have gained immensely from Brookings project, and I'm teaching courses on refugee and IDP analysis. So I have used a lot of material, a lot of research I have gained from. One comment I have on the guiding principles. The guiding principles, of course, have been very instrumental in national legislation. And implementation is also not so bad because many national governments have implemented. For example, Colombia has implemented a lot of guiding principles, have incorporated into their constitution. I think in addition to the guiding principles, what we might also look at is some principles at the global level on structural reforms. Looking at the institutions that are in charge of displacing the people in the first place. So unless we look at structural reforms, I think the guiding principles by themselves will not go a long way. Guiding principles have been enough in setting legislation for accommodation and provisions at a transitional level. But unless we reform the principles and the institutions that displace the people in the first place, we are not going to be able to look at the long-term solutions for that. And my question also is, one question is about the role of the international community on disputed territories, for example, Kashmir, Abkhazia, South Ossetia. I know that it is sensitive, it is political to get into the disputed territories, but unless the international community focuses on that, we are not really addressing displacement at a global level.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, in the back.
Thank you very much. I'm Ted Picone. I'm a senior fellow here at Brookings, and I want to make a comment and a question. First of all, a comment on some of the lessons learned about this project. I did some research analyzing the role of special procedures in the UN system and how they have impact at the national level. And when I got to Brookings, I started that project without really recognizing the value and the importance of this particular relationship that Brookings has had with the now Special Rapporteur on IDPs. And I can see, after doing all this research and comparing many different mandates and situations, that this partnership between a research institution and a mandate holder has made a huge difference in terms of impact. Independent experts of the UN system are pro bono, unpaid volunteers, free labor for the UN and for the human rights system. And by having an anchor and a continuity behind the mandate to support the research work has really made a big difference. Francis alluded to some jealousy even on this relationship. So I wanted to point that out. It's also important to note how the follow-up visits that in particular Walter made to countries after an initial visit, going back a year or two later has had a huge impact on following through on the implementation of laws and policies. So that's an important lesson learned for the whole UN system. And then the question is, your very interesting discussion about creative lawyering and trying to think about where we are now and what is the next move of creative lawyering that you see up ahead of us in this field or in the holistic sense. Certainly we've come a long way on R2P, but the controversy over Libya that's playing out now in Syria, I'm wondering, is that a temporary setback in this general progression toward responsible sovereignty, or is there something you see that will get us past this current impasse into something that goes even further?
Since we are running behind, maybe and we've had multiple questions in each question, so perhaps I'll come back and ask responses. Walter, you?
Yeah. Thank you for the questions. Let me address South Ossetia, Abkhazia. Actually, I managed to go to both places, lots of negotiations, but I'm very happy that you raised the issue because, and that's a more general thing, there shouldn't be kind of blank spaces on the map of human rights. And just because a territory is contested or occupied, it should not mean that human rights shouldn't play a role there. And I think, and that's part a bit of the creative lawyering, I did find some ways to get access and to make the argument that even though these territories regarded themselves as being totally independent, they were still bound by the relevant laws, provisions, and frameworks. That I'm very happy about you highlighting the importance of the partnership. Francis would say the same thing, but I can say very, very clearly that without Brookings, I could not have done what I did. And there was a lot of jealousy among special rapporteurs because some had a great support, including myself and others. And you can see differences that have nothing to do with the personalities of the mandate holder, but really that have a lot to do with this kind of infrastructure that is needed. And it's not so much that it's an unpaid voluntary position, even a full-time paid position couldn't achieve what the IDP mandate was able to achieve, because it's not just Brookings, it's a whole network. And Roberto always has been great in drawing in everyone, and I see familiar faces here in the room and beyond, and they all had contributed. And it was this kind of, one could say, almost movement that gave the great support to the mandate holder. Well, next steps, I think your question was too big to be answered before the coffee break. But to narrow it a little bit down to the displacement issues, I do think there are two areas. The one you mentioned, development-related displacement. We have Michael Chernia here, and we discussed it in the morning, the need also there to really address it, to talk about the national responsibilities, the laws, the provisions, the strategies. And then the other big area is what I'm now doing and involved with all the displacement linked to disasters caused by natural hazards, effects of climate change. Global warming is a reality, and it has impacts that are huge in terms of pushing people to move and displacing people. And if you can make advances also on that front, it would be very important. But then still we have all these conflicts and more conflicts and growing numbers. So just to repeat, it remains a huge challenge. Roberta was talking about the displacement crisis in the 1990s. We are really back to a huge displacement crisis.
Bob?
No, I have nothing really to add.
Okay. Shelley? No? One quick thing on the what next on it is that, you know, in some regard, I think separating the project from the research that's going on from the mandate may hold some opportunities, and not just, I think that in the formative stage of the last 25 years, it was very important to have those two processes together. But because I think so many of the challenges we'll hear about are ones of implementation and ones where I think a more ability to be a bit more critical with regard to the existing institutions may be very useful at this point. And I'm really pleased that Beth will be joining us at Georgetown, and I hope that we'll be able to play some of that role in the future.
Susan, if I may make a comment, since we're talking about the future, it would be to say that one of the lessons, Walter, you mentioned that there are protracted IDP situations. In fact, most of the IDPs and most of the refugees, for that matter, have been in that situation for a protracted period, whatever that is, 10 years, 20 years, for a very long time. And it's gone beyond simply dealing with it as a humanitarian situation. So perhaps one of the avenues to explore in the future, and one of the issues to press for also within the context of the SDG reflection, is to include IDPs more aggressively in development, I don't know whether it's development or what, in planning for the future, including them. Because their problems will be addressed, their solutions will be found, not just through blankets and cooking pots, obviously, but through more integrative initiatives that cover whole areas. And UNHCR is not going to take the lead on that, certainly, but we want to prompt other agencies as well to engage, international financial institutions and others, to engage from the onset of an emergency, and just as well from the onset of an IDP crisis, to look for that kind of solution-oriented approach.
And you have the last word. I'm giving it back to you.
Okay, I'll take the last word. I wanted to thank everyone for being here. I also wanted to say, as a follow-up to Jivan Thiagaraja's comments, and there's also somebody in the audience, Jimena Sanchez, who worked with the project and who has done so much in Colombia, that there is much greater need for international work and involvement with civil society in different countries. If this is strengthened, if resources and institutional structures are in place, so that those groups within their own countries can really be following and promoting, together with some regional and international support, the whole question of displacement, then it's seen not just as a national problem, as one that has to be in partnership with the international and the regional community. So I think that there lies a lot of it's a much bigger and sort of comprehensive coming together than just at the international level. And the laws, the policies, the just activities and the expectations of people at the national level and also at the international level coming together will bring us to this really international responsibility and national responsibility to protect these populations. And I think the next panel in Beth is going to be dealing, we've sort of handed over the future to her and her team. So it's a great pleasure to see everyone here and to recall how far we've come and how far we have to go. Thank you all.